So welcome to session 2, our first online session. This session is called The Invisible Substrates of LIS, Learning and Cognition, Ontology, and Epistemology. This session is about how certain aspects of philosophy and psychology can create part of the invisible substrate of library and information science, or LIS. The phrase invisible substrate comes from Marcia Bates, a very important thinker in our field and the author of one of your readings later this semester. When Bates describes the invisible substrate, what she's talking about is that our discipline of LIS has certain ideas, techniques, goals, and assumptions that are visible or explicit. These things come up in our journal articles, our textbooks, our library science courses, and our procedures and best practices out there in the field. But, according to Bates, there are also aspects of our discipline that are invisible. She uses the old iceberg metaphor of the parts of our discipline that are above or below the waterline. And she suggests that it's important for us to look below the waterline at the invisible substrates, that underwater part of the iceberg of library and information science, so that we can examine and, if warranted, even change any of our practices, beliefs, assumptions about how we do information science. Excuse me. Now, the composition of the invisible substrate, the stuff that's below the waterline, is different, according to Bates, than what we'll talk about tonight. She describes other aspects of our discipline as existing below the waterline. But I borrowed from her this term, invisible substrate, so that you, as you learn this, can understand that what we're doing in this lecture, looking at the philosophical and psychological underpinnings of information professionals and information seekers and users, these are concepts and processes that permeate everything we'll talk about henceforth in this course. And I would say even further down the road in your library science program. The practical and the theoretical, all of these are fruits that grow from the soil that is enriched with the complexities of philosophy and psychology. And when we can isolate these things, when we look at them and understand them at least a little bit, then we can do a better job, whether it's writing papers for classes, learning a new reference resource, helping a patron in the library, cataloging a book, or building a website, all because we understand what we're doing from a very fundamental level. So, like I said, in this presentation, we're going to look at philosophy and psychology as invisible substrates of library and information science. When we look at philosophy as an invisible substrate, what we're looking at are the underlying perspectives or paradigms that people and organizations have when they develop systems, or when they are information seekers who use information, or when they are individual practitioners who practice in the information professions. So your individual or organizational or cultural perspectives or paradigms have implications for information seeking from the user side and information systems from the information professional side. On the psychology side, we're especially interested in the cognitive and psychological processes of the information seekers and information users, because the ways that they think and the ways that they make decisions and pay attention and all of this do have implications for how they will seek information, what kinds of information systems they will need, how they will use those systems, what will be relevant to them, how they will want to inquire about it. Some of the answers to those design questions come from an understanding of the psychological and cognitive makeup of the people who are expected to use the systems. So let's get a little bit more familiar with our philosophy vocabulary. Tonight we're going to talk about terms, and we're going to talk about episteme and ontology as particular branches of philosophy. So Webster's defines a paradigm as a philosophical or theoretical framework. That's a little bit vague for me. I see a paradigm as a way of seeing the world. A paradigm includes our assumptions, many of which we don't even know we have. For example, the world of quantum physics is so confounding to scientists because the scientific paradigm includes the assumption that certain forces work throughout the universe. But gravity doesn't obey Newton's laws in quantum environments. So scientists are continually confounded because quantum level objects do not behave according to their assumptions. So currently they're trying to sort of establish new paradigms for understanding the quantum level. Right now, the scientific paradigm that encompasses the quantum level is that the universe has certain rules like gravity, magnetism, electromagnetism, so on and so forth. And all of those things work predictably in XYZ situations, except in the quantum universe. And so there's just sort of that asterisk there. And as they come deeper and deeper into an understanding of quantum mechanics and other aspects of quantum physics, then perhaps they can refine the paradigm and come up with an all-encompassing worldview that accounts for the different ways that the world behaves, whether on the large scale or the tiny quantum scale. But the underlying definition here, that the paradigm is a philosophical or a theoretical framework, just means that when you're walking around, you have certain assumptions about how things are, like that gravity exists, or that people are good, or that God exists, or God doesn't exist. And these things are just sort of internal and inherent in the way that you see and interact with the world. It's a very fundamental thing. So your personal paradigm isn't something that you can, write down on a piece of paper in a couple of minutes, or it's not going to be, something that you can say on, Facebook that you belong to the paradigm of XYZ, like you belong to a church or to a civic organization. Part of the paradigm is the epistemology. So epistemology is the branch of philosophy that asks, how do we know what we know? Or what does it mean to become known or knowable? Whenever we say that we know something, epistemology is there to ask you to critically look at how you think you know that. What did you know before that allowed you to assimilate that knowledge? How deeply do you know that? Can you teach it to a 5-year-old? So on and so forth. Ontology is the branch of philosophy that looks at what are the kinds of things that have existence. Ontology is the intellectual practice of naming, cataloging, organizing the objects in the world, the components of reality, the things in existence, and the relationships among those. So that's sort of your background philosophy vocabulary. And a lot of what we're talking about tonight has to do with paradigms, which include epistemologies and ontologies. I've isolated epistemology and ontology as aspects of a paradigm for us to look at because I think that those two fields of philosophy particularly have implications for library and information science, as we'll see a little bit further on in the presentation. So how exactly do paradigms come into play in the organization and management of information? Well, as I've said a couple of times before, and I'll say again, every representation is an interpretation. That comes into play because behind every information system is an implicit and or an explicit paradigm. So if we're looking at a traditional library system like the Library of Congress, the ontology that the Library of Congress presents to its users is the Library of Congress classification scheme or the Library of Congress subject headings. Those two things sort of constitute the vocabulary of what the librarians can say the books are about. If a book is about something that doesn't fall into those classification schemes or that subject heading list, then that book can't be described in the universe of the Library of Congress. So that is an act of ontology to create any kind of index or classification scheme or vocabulary for cataloging. Epistemology influences the user model. User model, that's sort of the term we use in our discipline to describe the way that the information system or the people who are designing the information system understand the user. So our user model, if we're the law librarian, says that our users are probably trained attorneys who have passed the bar and work for the practice that you're working for. Our user model also knows some of the things that these attorneys already know. It knows something about the kinds of time constraints that they work under. It might even know when an attorney comes to the law librarian with a particular task that they want the librarian to do. Based on the type of task, the librarian might be able to make some predictions as to the urgency or priority of getting that information relative to the other tasks that she has in front of her. So all of that has to do with the user model. It's the understanding of the people who design a system or the people who practice in the information professions about the characteristics of their user group. That's their user model. So your underlying paradigm can influence how you interpret or represent the behaviors or characteristics of your user group. It can influence which kinds of characteristics you pay attention to. It can also influence if you're working for the Library of Congress on their classification schemes. It can influence what kinds of relationships that you think should be included among the concepts and the subject headings in the classification scheme. So that's how paradigms come into play for us. Our paradigms color our interpretations of information, and our interpretations of information color how we represent information.